All right. So, hey, this is Arun Gupta. I'm one of the Docker captains and super excited to be with Laura Frank, who is another Docker captain. Hi, Laura.
Yeah. Hey, Arun, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Excellent. So, it's funny, how this webinar comes about. We were on a beautiful Docker captain scavenger hunt in Lake Washington a few days
Yes.
ago. And Laura works for Codeship. You want to talk about Codeship a little bit?
Yeah, Codeship is a continuous integration, continuous delivery company. So we provide a hosted service for CI/CD workflows. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's sort of an automated step bridging the gap between your repository of code, so GitHub or Bitbucket, and then your deployment endpoint. So you can push code to GitHub. Codeship will be notified. We'll run a series of automated tests, so the normal automated tests that you would run for your application, and then if those pass, we can kick off some deployment scripts or deployment steps for you. And Codeship is designed to be Docker native, and I think that's mostly what we'll talk about, given that we're both Docker captains and really excited about Docker.
Excellent. Fantastic. Yeah. And my connection here is I've authored the original Docker for Java developers workshop. And Laura and I were talking about it because Java developers all the time ask about a CI/CD solution. And Codeship being Docker native, we would like to see how we can take a Docker image, make it go through the entire pipeline, fail and pass and push to prod, basically that sort of stuff. So let's take a look. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen for a second so that we know what's our background. So I'm going to share my entire screen here. Okay, here we are. I'm going to go here and I'm going to go to GitHub Docker Labs. If I go there, um, then we look at Java here. And this is the Java workshop that was delivered at DockerCon. So you can see, it talks about basic concepts, building a Docker image, container, multiple containers, multiple hosts. Now, agreed, this needs to be upgraded for Docker 112 with Swarm built into it. That's pretty cool. There are Docker Java tools here, Docker container using Docker Cloud. So essentially, before I go into cloud, what I would like to do is add a section over there which would say, how do you do CI/CD for a Java application? And what I would like to do is I would like to pick maybe this multiple containers using Docker Compose application. And if I click on here, there is a Docker Compose file here, and I would like to see if I can put a CI/CD pipeline around these. So maybe add tests and see what fails, and see how Codeship can help us with that.
Yeah, so generally, anything that you can run with Docker Compose, you can basically take the Compose setup and use those service declarations in the Codeship setup. There are a couple of exceptions. So, for example, what I spent all day doing is updating our caching mechanism. So, a little bit of background of how Codeship and Docker work together. Codeship relies heavily on Docker Compose for syntax, service declaration to get you up and running, I guess, with Codeship a little bit faster and to make it a little bit easier to transfer things back and forth. So if you have a Docker Compose setup, you can basically use those services as a services declaration for the services in your CI/CD steps. The exception is that right now we are kind of pinned to Docker 1.9, and we will move to Docker 1.11 in just a few weeks, maybe not even, maybe a week and a half. We also rely heavily on Docker Registry, and we relied on it for remote caching. And that's sort of the breaking point, because if we think back to Docker 1.10 release, it was a breaking change. It was a minor version increase and shouldn't have been a breaking change, but it was, and we have to deal with it. So what happened basically, if you're not familiar, is the content addressable ID naming system was implemented. So right now, when we pull something down from the Docker registry, we don't get this nice parent-child relationship of layers. We just get like one flat layer, and it changed also the way that layer IDs are named. Our previous workflow with Codeship and how it works now until I release this new feature, probably later in the week, is that we pull down an image from the registry, and that functions as the cache. And then if we rebuild the image, it just reuses the layers that it's already built. This changes in 1.10, so we've been sort of pinned to 1.9. And the drawback of that is that Docker Compose v2 is only compatible with 110 and above. So I just looking at your Docker file, I can see that it's going to work just fine because we don't need necessarily a lot of changes to make it work with Codeship, but there usually is a one-to-one mapping with a couple of exceptions related to v2, which will be updated in the next month.
Okay, cool. Now, one of the big elephant in the room is when typically people talk about CI/CD, is they say, hey, you know what? I'm familiar with Jenkins. How is Codeship different, particularly from Docker perspective, from Jenkins?
Yeah, first of all, you don't have to. I guess the main difference is that you don't have to set Codeship up like you would Jenkins, and you don't have to maintain it yourself. So that's, I would say, most of the customers that we get, or most of our users that don't use Jenkins and have opted for Codeship instead, are using it because Jenkins has just been too challenging to implement themselves, and they just don't want to deal with it. They want to be able to give 2 YAML files and then have it done and not maintain Jenkins themselves. So that's really kind of the value that Codeship offers to companies that maybe are using Jenkins already, or a reason to use it instead. We, of course, have a free tier. So when I say customers, I'm not talking about people giving us money. I'm just talking about users in general.
So if I'm building, let's say I bought into the Docker dream and I have a Docker Compose file that I'm playing with, I just gonna go to Codeship, and you'll walk us through that anyway. I'll go to Codeship. I say, okay, give me my, here is my Docker Compose. You talked about Docker registry and all those things. All those things are going to be pre-set up for me.
Yeah, so if you have your Docker Compose file, then you can either rename it and add some other customizable stuff for the CI/CD step. You can use it directly if your use case is sort of simple enough. And then integration with Docker registry and other Docker native workflows, you can do just sort of natively with Codeship. So we designed the Docker infrastructure with the assumption that our users were not only running their applications in production with Docker, but also using Docker for development, and then using the image as sort of the way to distribute the application. So any step on Codeship can either be a step that runs a testing command, so run integration tests, unit tests, etc., or it can be a push step that will actually push something to the Docker registry. And then that push step, especially when we talk about Docker Cloud, can kick off a bunch of other deployment steps as well.
Gotcha. Okay, you know what? I think I instead of stories, I like to see some code. So
sure.
Why don't you share your screen and walk us through sort of the very first steps for getting started with Codeship, and then maybe later we'll see how we can integrate that part into the Docker for Java Developers workshop.
Sure. I think I have to download a browser extension, which is a big bummer, but this should be pretty quick.
Browser extension for what?
For the screen sharing, it's a different one than the normal BlueJeans. Okay, but you know what? That was so fast. We were not even done talking about it by the time we finished.
We may not have solved the audio problem. We might have solved this problem to an extent.
Yeah. So I'm gonna just kind of run through a couple of examples from the Codeship tool examples repo, which is available. It's a public repo on GitHub. And I'll show you a couple of things. So first I want to show how you can, of course, write your own Docker file and use your own Docker images inside of Codeship. And then I'll also show parallelization, which is a fun word to say. And then we can look at a Docker push step, so actually pushing some asset to a Docker registry. In this case, it'll be a local one. So I'll just go into this first Docker file. And if I look at the Docker file, we can see it's just really, really simple, basic Ruby application, or I guess Ruby image, and I'm adding some files to it. Codeship works with 2 configurable YAML files. So I mentioned Codeship services before, and this is basically a one-to-one mapping of your Docker Compose file. So if you could imagine an example of a really basic web application that you're using Docker Compose for, this is almost identical to it. So we have a demo Docker file service, a Docker Compose service, a demo hub service. Against those particular services, we can run some steps. So each step is run against a service. And in this case, we're just going to just to demo the tool and not have to deal with too many details of language or framework, we'll just say this is, we're going to check the Ruby version of all the different services that we've created. And the way that we'll do this is with the Jet tool. So the Jet tool is the exact same thing that will run in your hosted CI service. It's also available to download as a CLI so that you can check it sort of debug builds locally. And the steps command is the command that runs the testing steps that you've outlined in the Codeship steps file. And I'm on a fresh Docker machine VM. So I don't have these downloaded, so we'll just have to wait for the image to kind of pull from the Docker hub. And we can see that this step has started. In this case, I'm not doing a parallel step. We're just doing some serial steps. So this service Ruby version will complete, and then the next one will complete, and the next one will complete. So,
all right. Hold on. So a lot of things happen here. So
yeah, lots of things are happening.
So I'm going to ask questions now.
Sure.
Codeship dash services. Do I need to name the file like that, or can it be docker dash compose dot YAML?
Can definitely be docker compose dot YAML as well. So when you initialize and say Jet steps, Jet will look for the services file, and it sort of goes through an array of acceptable file names. So Codeship services or Jet services is like in position 1 and 2, but if those are not there, Docker Compose YAML will be used.
Okay, that's cool. So because I'm trying to find out what is my bare minimum bar to get the thing going. So Docker Compose is going to be there. Then in addition to Docker Compose.yaml, I need to have codeship-steps.yaml file.
Yep, exactly, because the services are just sort of the high-level things that you'll be interacting with. So a web application with a database, but it doesn't contain any of the information about testing steps that need to be run against the services. And that's where the steps file comes in. So the steps file is a list of exactly which testing steps or which deployment scripts or whatever kind of task you want to run against the services you've declared in the right order with the exact configuration that you want. So we can see here, I said run these steps, and we can see that this, first it was demo Dockerfile, demo hub, and then demo Dockerfile, doc compose. And I guess the build output might be a little hard to parse if you don't know what you're quite looking for, but we can see the service name is different for all of these. So we can see the Docker demo Dockerfile step ended with type success, and then we move to demo hub, which finished with success as well. And then at the end is this last one.
Is there a way to color code this output so that I can start seeing success failures kind of highlighted in a red or a green color?
Let's see. I don't think there is, to be honest, but there is a really good use case for that, and it's something that I've just learned to deal with, that I don't ever think about it. There's not.
I'm good at creating RFEs otherwise.
Yeah. So color, I think that's actually, I'll send that to our product team. That would be super helpful. I think that
because at the end of the day, this is a very simple service with just 2 services or 3 services and a simple, I know it's going to succeed. But most of the time the builds fail. And that's where I want to start debugging, give me orange, yellow, color coded so that I can parse the input.
Mm-hmm. Certainly when you run a build on the Codeship hosted infrastructure, all of the logs are nice and colorful. Just the CLI, the tool here doesn't have color. But that was kind of a boring, simple example because everything was in parallel everything was serial. And the really powerful thing about Jet and specifically Docker is that it enables task parallelism by firing up identical environments kind of across this virtual build machine that you have. And things can stay isolated because they're in containers, and that's like the point of using Docker for CI and CD. So our services file looks kind of the same. There's one service, which is the demo service, but our Codeship steps file is much different. So we have, we see an example of parallel groups here, parallel testing steps. So within this one testing group, we have a couple different steps. So we have a demo, a step against the demo service, which is just sleep to, and then we have some serial steps nested within a parallel step. So we can look at this file and sort of parse it because it's easy enough for humans to parse that we will have, this is the first step of parallel, and then this is also a parallel step. But within this step, it's a serial step, and then it has some nested steps in it. So we have sort of arbitrary nesting, which is totally open, like go wild when you use Codeship, especially with our Jet tool, because you can nest parallel serial steps, step groups, different types of steps, however they need to be to fit your particular use case.
Okay.
And when
does the tool Jet has any meaning, or?
Jet is just the, I guess because it's only 3 letters, it's nice to type. So some people have asked like, oh, why does Codeship have branding for the Docker tool, but then not for our classic infrastructure, which is not Docker based? And I think really the answer is that we have a CLI for this Jet tool that people can download. And of course you need some top level command, and Jet just seems nice. I think the point is that you can run tests really fast. So we call it Jet.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. But
yeah.
So you brought up a good point though. Codeship is Docker native. Does that mean it will not work with non-Docker infrastructures?
So it is not really designed to work with non-Docker infrastructure, and it can. And what we're trying to do now is sort of build out some useful tooling to help customers or users who don't use Docker run their tests and get the advantages of Docker without having to Dockerize their entire workflow. So most of the people that come and want to use Codeship are totally bought into the Docker ecosystem. They're probably using a private registry. Their whole app is Dockerized in development and in production, and they want to fill in the testing step with Docker as well. But we do have some users that maybe are just trying Docker out, or maybe they haven't quite bought into the whole ecosystem. And I think it's easy enough to provide like a sensible base image for those customers, and then they can kind of dump in their application and then run tests against it. I would say Jet is probably designed to work best if your application is Dockerized from the start, but gotcha. It's not, doesn't mean 100% that you have to use Docker.
Yeah, understood. Okay, yeah. Cool.
So here in this step, we can see like some more interesting stuff happening. Because these steps are running like in parallel and in serial, and they're sort of all mixed up. So of course we're bound to like one line at a time. So the parallelization is not necessarily best represented in log output, but it's a pretty good approximation. But we can see like all of these are type success finished, but we can see the test runner kind of bouncing between the two.
Right.
And then if we actually go back to this one, which is lots of parallel, we can see that this is basically identical to what I just ran, but instead it's tons and tons and tons of parallel. And we'll be able to really keep track of how these tests are being run in an arbitrary parallel order, because each of the testing steps is assigned a number. So if I say get steps with this, we can see that each of them, it doesn't really, for some reason, 25 started, but then the rest of them are in order. If I ran this again, we would see a different order. And you can even see as it's finishing, they're not in order at all. Everything is truly just run in parallel. And that took, 4 seconds to finish? And that was 25 independent testing steps.
Now, does this parallel testing depend upon the number of cores or anything like that on your infrastructure or workers, or how does it work?
So the parallel testing is really independent of your infrastructure. The things that come from you that might limit the speed are sort of the dependency provisioning at the very beginning. So if you are running a bunch of parallel steps against a service that has 5 dependencies, all of which need their own container, it might be a little slower because we have to wait for those services to become healthy before we can start executing things against them. But in general, if you have very high performant well-engineered cluster like dependencies and main services, things run super quick. So for example, we have a customer who without parallelization in their testing, even with Docker, the CI/CD step took like close to an hour, I want to say 50 minutes. And when they introduced parallelization with Docker, it went down to about 15. So you can really see some some pretty significant gains and some pretty significant benefits just from being able to split out testing commands and run them in parallel with one another.
Now, one of the things that I've seen particularly during testing is, you tag your images as latest. If you do tag your images as latest, then it is always downloading the image from GitHub or Docker Hub. And I believe you mentioned something about caching using Docker registry. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So caching using Docker registry right now, as it functions, is that we generate a custom tag for your cached image asset. So if you're on, for example, if you're on branch master and you have a build where caching is enabled, we will look for your image with the tag Codeship cache master. And if that exists, we'll just pull it down. And then when we rebuild the image again from the Docker file that you specified, we can just reuse the layers that are built already from the Docker pull from the registry. In the future, so like next week when this feature is released, so you're getting a bit of a sneak preview, instead of the interaction with the registry, what we're doing is saving the image, uploading that asset to S3, and then when you have caching enabled, we'll pull down the asset from S3 and load it into Docker instead of dealing with the registry. So currently after 110, and that's kind of not even true because it's after 111 because it was broken for one full minor version. After 111, the only way to repopulate the local image cache with some sort of remote caching, I guess we could call it, or persistent caching is via Docker load and save. And since Codeship is a distributed kind of ephemeral system, we don't persist build machines. We have to find somewhere that we can persist those assets. And for us, S3 was just the easiest choice or the most straightforward choice.
So in essence, Codeship is a SaaS for Docker native CI/CD pipelines?
Yep, I would say that's.
And does it run all on? So go ahead.
Oh yeah, I would say that's like a really good way to describe us. Is just a hosted or SaaS solution for CI/CD with Docker native support.
Okay. And is it all running on Amazon or what sort of infrastructure?
Yeah, so the build machines are running on Amazon, but you can deploy anywhere. It's not limited to where our build machines happen. And in fact, our build machines and the AZs that our build machines are in are sort of like an afterthought and not really super important. So ideally in the future, we would love to have multi-backend support. So there are a couple really, really cool tools that we would love to use. For example, Karina, which is sort of a Docker Swarm as a service from Rackspace.
Yeah.
We have lots of proof of concepts and prototypes about using Karina for Codeship builds, and it's super cool. And we'll work on it, in a bit. So we're still a really small engineering team, and of course we'd love to go forward on all the stuff that we want to work on, but sometimes it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask is, and I kind of phased out for about 5 seconds over there. I couldn't hear you. But is it possible to run Codeship on-premise as well?
It is right now not possible to run Codeship on-premise. We don't yet have an on-premise solution because we still a small company, small engineering team, and we came up sort of from individual developer, we're moving into small, medium business, and then eventually we'll offer an on-prem solution, but we don't have a kind of release roadmap for that yet. What you can do is run the Jet CLI locally, but there's no mapping to sort of a hosted solution with the Jet CLI.
Okay, understood. So, all right. So I guess what I want to see is in that case, I'm bought into the Docker dream. I have a Docker compose file.
Isn't it so good? Yeah.
I've taken the red pill and I'm going down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to find out how deep it goes.
Yeah.
So I guess now I'm going down the rabbit hole and I have a basic app working with Docker enable. and now I want to build a
Hmm.
CI/CD pipeline. I find out about this cool tool. I went to DockerCon. I attended Laura's talk, and she said, "Doc, yeah, it's a Docker native tool, and I want to try it out. So what do I do?"
Okay, so I'm gonna just give you a quick demo of the tool that I gave a demo of at DockerCon. And this is a really small notes app. And we can see that I have a couple different Docker files in here. We won't really pay attention to some of them yet. Maybe we'll just look at what's in my Docker Compose file first, which is that this is a Rails application. It's going to be running on port 3000, and it is going to build its image from this Docker file that I have, just Docker file, no extension. And if we look at that, we can see that it's basically
wait, one thing. So in this case, I see you're still using links. Now, Docker 1.9 added networking, which allows overlay networks, and links are restricted to a single host.
Yep. And the reason that I'm using links is because of the limitation regarding caching, and the reason why Codeship has stayed on 1.9 for so long. So as soon as I ship this caching feature, along with my team, of course, it's not just me working on it, but so next week and then into the next month, Codeship will upgrade to probably 1.11. And then once we do that, then it will be sort of be free reign for using 1.10 Compose v2 updates. So right now we're sort of pinned down to 1.9, which is why I'm still using links. Also, I give this demo to people who are very, very new to Docker and are still just trying to think about like how the heck can one container even communicate with each other. And I think links is just a little bit easier to suggest to them and say it's a link. It's like a connection between two things versus going into the whole what networking is and how we can create an overlay network, etc. So, but you're totally right. You're totally right that we could do this a couple different ways. So let's just take a peek at my images right now. Been doing a lot of testing today. So we can say Docker Compose up and just like look at Compose up. We'll do -D for good measure. And we'll just build this image and then hopefully see everything running just fine. And then from there, we can look at the similarities between my Docker Compose file and then the testing tasks that I might want to run against this application that I'm running.
So so far, I've not gone to any of the. Is my first step to make sure my Docker Compose is up and working?
I would say the very first step for getting started with Codeship is first to have an application that works really well with Docker. That's going to eliminate a lot of the friction when you get to set up your CI/CD steps, because it really should be a total mirror of everything you do in development and everything you do in production. We're just sort of filling in the testing. So if you don't have it working in production, you don't have it working in development, it's going to be really hard to get it working in a test environment.
Okay. And so once, let's say, while this Docker Compose is coming up, what can I do in the meanwhile? Can I download a tool or something? Can I go to a website or something?
Yeah, you can go to, there's a nice bit.ly Codeship Jet tool, and that will send you to the documentation page for the local Codeship tool. So downloading the CLI. So all the demos that I did earlier are just local. They're not running on Codeship's hosted infrastructure at all. And that's a really huge advantage of using Docker, since you can run it locally with Docker Machine or Docker for Windows and Mac. You don't need to have a special setup in order to do it. You can just run it on your own infrastructure, your own local host, I should say.
Now, would this work with Docker for Mac?
Yeah, definitely. So right now I'm using Docker Machine only because today I wanted to do some testing and I wanted to persist a couple different environments. Normally you would see me using Docker for Mac because it's awesome and I love not having a dependency on VirtualBox.
Right. Because, Docker for Mac particularly, it auto updates it itself and it is running today at 112 or C3.
Yeah.
So how would this tool work in that case?
Yep, it works totally identically. The only difference is that with Docker for Mac, you'll be able to use things like the service directive and other nice things from Docker 112 that Codeship doesn't yet support. But everything that Codeship does support, you'll be able to use with Docker for Mac.
Okay.
If you feel, yeah, if you're feeling really like you really want parity, you can certainly fire up a VM and download and use Docker Engine 1.9.1, and then you'll have a totally analogous environment. But everything that works on Codeship will work on 1.12, but everything that's working on 1.12 RC3 might not work with Codeship.
Right. So basically, you are getting the latest runtime, but you got to be compatible. Your source file need to be compatible with 1.9.
Yes, exactly. For now, for just a couple more days, and
Yeah.
then we'll get to the future.
Okay.
So
Well, hopefully by the time we get to end up recording the section where we actually convert or
yeah,
create a chapter in the Docker for Java, that would be already out.
yes, I hope so too. It's been
Okay.
a lot of planning and a lot of work,
I'm
and
sure.
we're super excited. We just released part of it today behind a feature flag, and it was an exhilarating moment to merge that pull request.
Yeah. Totally.
And of course, without saying, the Codeship is deployed using Codeship. So we're really motivated to keep things really on par and in sync with Docker because we use Docker. Like as an engineer, aside from where I work, I use Docker and I want my tools to support exactly what I want to do. So, oh, cool. Our Docker Compose is finished. So we can check out what's happening here. And I just have some nice aliases because I hate typing. That's why I became an engineer. Oh, okay, cool. So we have our application running, and we'll just run rake db create. So this is just normal sort of developing with Docker Compose stuff. We'll get this running, and then we'll run some migrations. And this
now, you are using a Ruby and Postgres app here, but it's by no means is language agnostic or anything like that.
I'm sorry, one more time. It is totally language agnostic. Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. So it's not. It is completely language, database, platform agnostic because that's the benefit that Docker provides.
Yep, exactly. So if you can get it running with Docker Compose and you can run it with Docker, you can run it with Codeship. You're at every single step and every single service, you are deciding what application, which image, exactly how your service is going to be built. So, oh, okay, cool. I haven't looked at this app in a while, so it's great that we have some issues, but that's fine. We can see that Rails server is running, and we're using Docker Compose just sort of as we intend. The interesting part comes when I want to actually run this on Codeship. So just let's step back a little bit and say, this is my Docker Compose file. And in Docker Compose, it's a pretty common workflow if you've not used Docker Compose before, to mount your source code into the container via the volume mount. So I'm going to mount my working directory into some other directory in the container. This is a pretty common development workflow. But of course, in testing, I don't want to do that because my infrastructure is remote and I don't have access to my local host. So I actually have to copy things over. So when we look at our Codeship services file.
Well, so hold on. I'm still very new to Codeship. Where do I find out about Codeship services first?
You can look on our handy documentation page, codeship.com/documentation/Docker is where all of the Docker things live. Let me just back up there because it auto-completed. So within this Codeship documentation Docker, there are tons and tons of resources about how to get started, simple workflows, tutorials about common workflows, and you'll also see services configuration and steps configuration documentation. So we're concerned with services right now because that's the starting point. You want to have services before you define steps to run against the services.
Right.
So we have what is your services file, basically Docker Compose base file. We have some requirements and then a couple examples. So we have with Docker Compose v1, like one-to-one parity, and then we've also extended a couple things to make it easier to use with Codeship. But anything that you can use with Docker Compose v1, no problem to use it with Codeship. Environment variables, volumes, We even allow you to run Docker inside Docker, which is a common workflow for Jenkins as well, caching images, etc. So there are a couple like caveats, unavailable features, and we have all of that documented here. So in the Docker services configuration, you can see all the documentation. And then there's also the steps configuration, which is the companion to it. So what is it? How do I use it? How should I write it, etc.
Gotcha. And there is a sample file that I can get started with, which will allow me to write codeship-steps.yaml.
Yep, exactly. So you can see some examples, and then based on that, and based on if you're unfamiliar with YAML, maybe you want to check out some tutorial on like how YAML is structured. But in general, YAML is pretty easy to understand. It's very human readable. So with those two things combined, it's pretty easy to get up and running with these things. So we can look at like there's a couple differences here. The database is mostly the same. I guess in testing, I just wanted to pin it down to a version because it's more reliable.
Yeah.
In the app, so I guess app and web are the equivalent services. We can see that I have this encrypted Docker config path, and that's because I want to push to an image as part of my deployment step. And of course, I have to provide credentials in order to push to my repository.
So the Docker CFG.encrypted is where your credentials are stored?
Yep, exactly. So every project on GitHub gets its AES key, and you can encrypt things, and then we decrypt it. So it's based on the project level, scoped to the project level of, so things like credentials for the Docker Hub or any sort of credentials for a different registry, you would use this AES key that's scoped to your project. So make sure that key is in your git ignore. Never commit that.
Yeah. Now that would be really cool, because if that kind of a functionality can be incorporated in the Docker Compose itself, because I presume this feature is not required just for CI/CD, but others can benefit from it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we found that it's super helpful for any sort of secret encryption.
Yeah.
Secret handling is a real big challenge, and I guess it's been a bit easier in the recent months, but it's always a kind of a hard problem to solve when you get started with Docker.
Yeah.
So we can see then in the app that I'm basically using a different Docker file to build my application. And if we take a peek at this Docker file, if we type cat correctly, first of all, we can see it's like pretty much the same, with the exception that I'm just copying everything. Yeah. And the reason I set it up this way is that, as you know, of course, you're a Docker captain, that Docker caching and on the layer level is really powerful, and it's really great to optimize your Docker files in order to take advantage of the cache. So my gem file is not going to change very frequently, so there's no point in rebuilding it every single time. But my other source files, so that's why they're split up in that way. So the main difference is just instead of using a volume, I'm just going to copy everything here.
Right.
And we still have this link between the app is dependent on the database. We also have this extra deploy service, which uses its own Docker file, which is pretty much actually, I think, identical to the test Docker file. I split them out because there's probably going to be some other deploy steps. Of course, the environment variable is different. That's why they have to be. So
is it a common practice to kind of put this test and deploy and all of these services together in one Codeship-services.yaml?
Yes, it is, because when we look at our steps, we can see one of actually probably my favorite feature about Codeship, which is this tag attribute on the deploy step. And the reason that it's safe to kind of have everything commingling in the services file is that your steps are executed against only the service that you declare. And in this case, my deploy service is something that's totally different. And I just have I have one step that's executing against the deploy service. And all that is pushing my application, so pushing the image that I've just made to the Docker Hub. And it's only going to execute if the tag of my branch matches master. So I could also have it match like a numerical minor, major minor version, or major minor patch tag format, like a numerical type format. I just love pushing everything that's on master is in production in my world, in Codeship's world. So That's why I have this tag. But it's super safe to have all of your services in your services file, Codeship services, because they will only ever be accessed if you write a step in your Codeship steps file.
Right, right. So now I have a Docker Compose. I still don't know about steps and services file. So I don't need a services file because I have a Docker Compose. Now, is there
Yep.
a way for me to generate codeship-steps.yaml from the Docker Compose file, or do I have to handcraft it?
Steps is something totally different from the Docker Compose. So Docker Compose might have the command for your container to start. So in this case, Rails server, but it doesn't have anything related to the testing steps that I might want to execute, like RSpec, linter steps, Rails best practices, etc. So those things are usually either run manually by the developer during development or in some other testing script, or some services, other CI services allow you to say, okay, run these steps in sequence. And the benefit with Jet and with Docker is that you can split them up and run them in parallel.
Right, right.
So this
okay.
is something that you have to write by hand, because it's up to you to decide which steps should be parallel, what you want your deploy steps to do, which conditions you want each step to run in.
Yeah, well, I'm a lazy guy, so I was thinking, here's my Docker, here's a Docker Compose, just generate, because I understand the testing steps I need to put in there, but take my Docker Compose, generate a serial, Codeship steps for me, and then I'll tweak around and add my steps. But I guess not for now.
Not for now, for the lazy people among us like you, that it is something that has crossed our minds, and something that we've had requests for is like an automatic steps generator, for example. So it's pretty easy to tell, like, oh, this is a Python application. The most common Python step command or testing commands are these things. So why not just spit them out into a nice little YAML file? And also transitioning people, maybe people who have not used Docker before or who are just getting used to Dockerizing their application, something like that would be super helpful, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely in the future, but just not yet. So you'll have to type some stuff.
Damn, life is hard.
Yeah, but we can run the steps and we can see. I have first this group of parallel steps, so 4 of them, and we can see them fire up right here.
Yeah.
And then as soon as the app is built, we'll see like the database come up, and then things will just kind of pass back and forth, and hopefully we should see them all finish with success. But I'm not so convinced after seeing that error. But that's the whole point. I'd rather have it fail now than have it be failing in production.
Yeah, we'll find out. We'll find out.
Yeah, we'll see. This seems to be fine. So when I ran Docker Compose and I built some of these already, so we can use the cache. Apparently our bundle was invalidated, so we have to build it again. That might just take a little bit. But while we're waiting for this to build, do you have any questions or any point that I could clarify for you?
So I think I understand the concept now. As a Java developer, because the application is written using Java, and it's using Wildfly and Couchbase as a database. Wildfly is the app server, Couchbase is a database. The app is built using Maven. So for a Java developer, in order to get started, they typically have a Maven test target. So essentially what I'll do is I have a Docker Compose. I say Docker Compose up -d that fires up my services. Then I will say jet steps, and in the codeship-steps.yaml, I'll say, here are my steps, and I want them to do serially for now, Maven test or Maven deploy or Maven package, and then they'll put all their in there, right?
Yep, exactly. And then once you figure out exactly where you can optimize your testing workflow, you can take those serial steps and instead change them to a parallel testing group. So it's just one like type parallel and then write the steps underneath them to group them in a parallel group. And that way Jet and Codeship know that these steps are okay to run in parallel, but these steps should be in serial. So for example, you never want to have a deploy step as a parallel step with some of your testing steps. It might seem tempting because you're like, oh, just run everything in parallel. But what happens then is that you might have failing tests, and then your deploy step still succeeds and you deploy broken code. So
well, the whole thing needs to deploy first before test.
Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah. So, today what we have done so far is, we have only looked at the CLI tool sort of for the local environment. We haven't looked at it exactly how the SaaS environment is going to look like. I'm not sure if we'll actually have time for it today.
Yeah, we should. As soon as it finishes, I will commit maybe a dummy commit to GitHub, and we can see the webhook trigger a build on Codeship, and then we can look at what the logs look like on the UI.
Sounds
so,
cool.
and in fact, we can look at the previous build because there's no sense in waiting, right?
Well, so then help me get started. Okay, I come to codeship.com now. I'm a brand new user. How do I get started?
So as a brand new user, the first thing to do, of course, is to create an account. And you don't need to enter payment info to like create an account. You can just create one. Of course, the Jet CLI to download, you also don't need to have an account for that. So
that's actually a good deal, because that's already a lower bar to entry. Because the moment you ask a credit card, people start thinking that you're going to charge it. By not asking that, I think that's a good thing.
Yep, I totally agree. It appears that I've run a couple of builds on here that have failed, so I probably should have been alerted to the fact that there's something wrong. But okay, cool. So this is finishing, but it doesn't really matter. It's just going to trigger basically the same build on Codeship. So you'll set up a new account, and then from your account, you can set up a new project. There are a couple of different types of accounts, and if you're just getting started as an individual person, a personal account is probably the right choice for you. We also have organizations. So for example, you can see that I'm part of a couple different organizations. Codeship Legacy, we have a dummy organization called Poo, which is our testing organization. So it's where things break, so we have a funny name for it. But I'm under my personal account right now, and we can see there's a couple projects that I've set up with Codeship. And Notes app is the thing that I was looking at. So I can.
Wait, hold on. So the idea of organization really is where people in a team can collaborate?
Yep, exactly. And you can, of course, set permissions that this person is an admin, this person is an owner, this person has only read-only rights, and they can't actually trigger a build, but they can read builds that are already existing, for example.
So there is a RBAC capability that already exists.
Yep, exactly. So
now, can that RBAC be tied to the LDAP realm or anything like that, or you have to define it in the app?
As far as I know, you do have to define it in the app, but I would have to check on that because to be honest, I'm not totally sure of the answer.
But because I think one thing that would be cool is, I have like 5 guys in my team. If I'm building up something, I can say, you know what, I've defined the roles in my LDAP directory already. Just map it to that and go figure out from that. Everybody in the administrator group has full access. Everybody in such and such group have this access. That would be useful.
Yeah, that does sound actually like a pretty useful thing. But I think hearing you describe it, I'm pretty sure that we don't have that capability yet. But that is a great product request or feature request.
Yeah.
So cool. So we have a couple. Let's take a peek at the output from the local build, because I want to just highlight the fact that we have this at the very end, step skipped, deploy. Yeah. And the reason that it's skipped is, of course, because I wasn't on master. So it's great that we didn't deploy from there. But here is a push to master, and we can see that all the steps did happen. We can see our services here. So this will load, and we can take a peek at everything. We see this is using cache because it was cached. Our database is just pulling the image from the Docker Hub, verifying that it's fine, saying downloaded the image. And then we can actually maybe better visualize the step groups using the UI, because we have a nice ability to expand and collapse them. So this is a serial group of 2 steps. It just happens that the first step is a parallel group. So we can see all of these, and where this build running, we could see them run in parallel. And then I'm able to look at the output for each of the steps isolated and not all jumbled up like they are with the local CLI. And of course, we do have some nice coloring. So if things fail, you can see that they're failing pretty easily. Right. Of course, it's limited to what the tool itself outputs. So we can see that there's some red here because of some real best practices failures, but not much green because that's sort of how the tool deals with it.
So and then this part of the syntax coloring is language specific.
Yep, it is, and not only language specific, but specific to the particular tool that you use. So if you have RSpec enabled with color, then we will output the colored output that RSpec gives us. Gotcha. But if RSpec doesn't give us colored output, we can't really output it.
Now, do you have integration with Maven?
You can check. There is, I think, a whole Codeship Java Maven. Maybe it's a good thing to search for. So I will not lie to you and say that I used Java when I was in grad school for my CS degree, but I have not used it since then. So we live in sort of different worlds that are linked together with Docker. Isn't it just a beautiful thing?
No, I think that's perfect because what I can do is I think we have got a very good overview today of Codeship, what its capabilities, tools, at least some of it is. We have probably scratched the surface, and there's a lot more we can cover.
Mhm.
But I think next week or maybe whenever we are ready, I would like to come back and say, here is my Docker Compose application because that's the language you talk, that's the language I talk, and what I'll
Yeah.
do is I will say, here is my command to test. So we will talk in our own world, but still be connected using the Docker language.
Yep, it's a great thing. And the great thing is that Docker is sort of the common denominator between all of these things where I can implement something in Golang and you can do the same thing in Java and it's going to behave the same way because we're using Docker together. So I'm really excited to get that up and running. In the meantime, if you want to look through, we have some Java documentation about specific things that might be more in your world. That would also be great. So I think we have this whole Java and JVM based language as part of our documentation that will help you kind of navigate exactly the stuff that you'll need.
Right. So I think for now, the application doesn't have any tests, the one in the Docker Java lab.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is I will update that app so that it does have a test, and I'll add maybe a few tests so that one test failed, one test passed, and stuff like that. And then when we are ready next time, then let's build a full project where we'll have Codeship steps and everything that we can add. You send a pull request, and then we'll merge it over there so that the lab content itself is ready. That, oh, you know what? You looked at the app itself. The app has been upgraded to include tests, and now let's build a CI/CD pipeline with it.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Perfect. I think this is very good. I think we are coming to a logical end. Do you have anything to wrap up?
The only thing I have to say is that if you want to check out the Codeship documentation, codeship.com/documentation is a easy way you can search through all the stuff and figure out the Codeship tool examples on the github.com/Codeship public repository list is also a good place. If you want to download the Jet CLI and run through a couple of examples, then that's also a good place to start. So.
Fantastic. So I'm going to be playing around with, I guess, Codeship for the first time and see how the adventure goes.
Awesome. Cool. Right. Email me any questions.
Yeah, we all end up taking a blue pill or a red pill every day. So I'm taking another red pill and see how it goes.
Sounds great.
Take care, Laura. Thanks for this.
Awesome.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye.